The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of something far greater than ink and paper. The neatly printed words in front of me blurred as my vision swam. I forced myself to focus, my gaze landing on the bold title at the top. Prenuptial Agreement. Across the table, Andrew sat with an air of forced ease, his fingers tapping an unhurried rhythm against the polished wood. His face was unreadable, carefully composed. But I knew him too well. The subtle tightness in his jaw. The way he held his breath just for a second, as he waited for my reaction. "It's just a precaution, Sophie," he said, voice smooth, practiced. "You understand, right? Just in case. Just in case." The words sat heavy between us. A shield. A safeguard. A carefully constructed exit plan. I forced a smile, though my stomach twisted violently. Sure. Just a backup plan. A backup plan. For what, exactly? 7 years together. 7 years of late-night study sessions, of scraping by in our tiny apartment, of whispering promises about the life we were building. Now, at the threshold of that future, he wanted me to sign this, a contract that made one thing devastatingly clear. He was planning for a version of his life that didn't include me. My fingers tightened around the pen. My heart pounded against my ribs. Don't be emotional. Be smart. The ink felt final as it bled onto the paper. Andrew exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing as he reached for my hand. "Thank you, baby. I knew you'd understand." I smiled. The kind of smile I had learned to wear over the years, the kind that hid everything. Because what Andrew didn't know was that I had already seen his secret. It started 2 weeks earlier. I had never been the type to snoop. We had always been open about money, at least I thought we had. He had access to my salary, my investments, my savings. We were a team. But that day, while searching for an email on his laptop, a notification popped up. A bank statement. An account I had never seen before. I shouldn't have clicked. But something, instinct, or maybe just the quiet voice inside me that had been warning me all along, pushed me forward. And then I saw it. $150,000. Not from his paycheck. Not from our joint savings. Hidden. Separate. A backup plan. My breath caught. For what? For who? I tried to push it from my mind. To rationalize it. Maybe it was for a surprise honeymoon. Maybe he was saving for something big. But later that night, when I casually brought up our savings, he barely looked up from his phone. "You handle the money, babe. I don't even look at that stuff." He looked me in the eyes and lied. That was when I knew. Andrew wasn't just planning for a life with me. He was preparing for a life without me. And then last night he had sealed it. "Sophie, I need you to sign a prenup. Just something simple." Simple. Just like that, my worst fear was confirmed. Now, as I sat across from him, the ink still drying on the document that locked me out of his future, I forced myself to stay calm. He had a backup plan? Fine. I'd make sure he needed it. The next morning, I woke up with a plan of my own. Andrew thought he had it all figured out. That I would sign the prenup and continue planning our wedding, blissfully unaware. That I would never question his escape route. He was wrong. I parked outside the law office, gripping my coffee like a lifeline. Beside me, a manila folder sat on the passenger seat, holding everything I had collected. The prenup. The bank statements. Screenshots of his hidden account. I didn't know exactly what I wanted yet. Revenge? A way out? The truth? But I knew I wouldn't leave this office empty-handed. The receptionist led me into a sleek, modern room where my lawyer, Mr. Weston, waited. Late 50s, sharp eyes. The kind of man who had seen every possible way a relationship could unravel. I slid the prenup across the desk. "I need you to tell me exactly what this means for me." He flipped through the pages with practiced ease. Minutes passed in silence. Then he leaned back, tapping his pen against the contract. His gaze lifted to mine, sharp with something almost amused. "Tell me, Sophie. Are you sure he's the only one with a backup plan?" Weston leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the contract as a slow smirk crept across his face. "Let me ask you something, Sophie." His sharp eyes locked onto mine. "Are you sure he's the only one with a backup plan?" A chill ran down my spine. My fingers curled into my lap. "What do you mean?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. He exhaled, shaking his head like he'd seen this 100 times before. Your fiancé made a critical mistake. He thought he was smarter than he is. He flipped to a section of the prenup, tapping his pen against the page. This contract? It's built to protect him. If you divorce, you leave with only what's in your personal bank account. No claim to his assets, his investments, nothing. I swallowed hard. Already knew that part. But, Weston continued, his smirk deepening, he forgot to protect his hidden savings. I blinked. What? He slid the document toward me, pointing at a clause regarding separate assets. A properly drafted prenup requires full disclosure. Every account, every property, every financial tie. That's standard. He paused, watching me closely. But Andrew? He only listed the joint assets and his primary checking account. The realization slammed into me like a freight train. He had never disclosed the hidden account. Legally, it wasn't protected. Weston leaned forward, his grin widening just slightly. So, Sophie, if that money was earned during your relationship and isn't covered under the prenup? I sucked in a breath. It's fair game. I stepped out of the law office with my pulse pounding in my ears. My fingers itched to grab my phone, to call Andrew and demand answers, to throw his deception back in his face. But I didn't. Andrew had played the long game. Now, so would I. That night I made dinner just like I always did. Warm, comforting. The kind of meal he loved. I kissed him on the cheek when he walked in. Smiled when he made a joke. Let him talk about his day like everything was normal. But inside I was watching. Calculating. Waiting. Because men like Andrew don't just make one backup plan. They make several. And if I was going to make sure he needed that secret savings account, I needed to know exactly how deep his deception ran. The next day I started looking. First it was small things. Bank deposits that didn't match his paycheck. Expenses that didn't add up. Inconsistencies I might have ignored before. I wanted to believe I was wrong. That maybe he was just bad with money. That I was reading too much into it. But then I found the emails. And suddenly everything made sense. Andrew wasn't just planning for a future without me. He was planning one with someone else. It was a Saturday morning when I finally found it. Andrew had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. I told myself I wouldn't snoop. That I had already found enough. But then I saw it. A single subject line in his inbox. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. I froze. The sender's name? Madison. My hands turned cold. My pulse roared in my ears. I clicked. The message was short. Too casual. Too familiar. Hey babe, I can't stop thinking about last weekend. I know we said we'd keep things slow, but it's getting harder to wait. My stomach churned. His response sat just below. Me too, gorgeous. Just be patient a little longer. Things are almost in place. Almost in place. The room tilted. My breath hitched. I scrolled further. Hotel bookings. Dinner reservations on nights he told me he was working late. My vision blurred as I stared at the evidence laid out in front of me. Andrew wasn't just saving money to protect himself. He was saving it for her. Payments to a jewelry store. I stared at the transaction, my stomach twisting into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. Jewelry. Expensive. And not for me. Andrew wasn't just protecting himself. He was preparing to replace me. The next few hours blurred together. I don't remember how I started searching, but once I did I couldn't stop. Every statement, every hidden transaction, every digital breadcrumb he had so carelessly left behind. I followed them all. And what I found made my blood turn to ice. The secret savings account? Not just for him. He was funneling money to her. The prenup? Not just a precaution. It was a carefully laid trap to ensure I walked away with nothing. The engagement ring on my finger? Probably a placeholder until he could slip a different one onto hers. And the worst betrayal of all? A lease agreement. Signed by Andrew. For a condo. With Madison. He had planned everything. The wedding. The honeymoon. The fake future with me. All of it was a stall. Because the moment his plans were finalized, he was going to leave. That night I lay beside him in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breathing. His back was turned, his body relaxed, as if he hadn't just shattered everything I thought we had. I had given this man 7 years. My trust. My love. My everything. And in return, he had been building an escape route right under my nose. I could have confronted him right then. Could have thrown my ring in his face, screamed, demanded answers. But that would have given him control. That would have given him the reaction he expected. And if Andrew thought he was going to walk away from this untouched, he had no idea who he was dealing with, because now I wasn't just going to make sure he needed that secret account. I was going to make sure it was all he had left. The art of pretending Andrew thought he had everything under control, that I was clueless, that I would keep planning our wedding while he planned his escape, that I would never question the prenup, that I would never find his hidden life. He was wrong, and I was about to make sure he regretted underestimating me. For the next week, I did something I never thought I'd do. I pretended. I played my role perfectly, the devoted fiancé, the excited bride-to-be. I kissed him goodbye in the mornings. I laughed at his jokes. I let him believe I was still in the dark. But the moment he walked out the door, I got to work. The investigation begins. My first stop was a forensic accountant, someone my lawyer recommended. I handed over everything: bank statements, hidden account details, transactions to Madison. "Can you track where the money is coming from?" I asked, my voice calm, controlled. The accountant barely hesitated. "Absolutely. If he's been moving assets in preparation for leaving you, we'll find it." Andrew thought he had covered his tracks. What he didn't know was that I was already a step ahead. Face to face with the other woman next, I went to Madison's condo. I wasn't reckless. I didn't go inside. Didn't knock. I just waited. And sure enough, she arrived. She was exactly what I expected: young, pretty, naive. The kind of woman who believed in whispered promises and stolen glances. The kind of woman who thought a man who cheated on his fiancé would never do the same to her. She walked inside, blissfully unaware. And I smiled, because if she thought she had one, she hadn't seen anything yet. Laying the trap that night, I set my plan into motion. After dinner, I poured Andrew a glass of wine, his favorite. I let him relax, let him settle into the comfort of our home. Then, as casually as ever, I said, "I was thinking, maybe we should move some of our savings into a joint account. To prepare for the wedding." I watched him carefully, the way his grip tightened on the glass for just a second, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes before he smoothed it over. His voice easy, effortless. "That's sweet, babe," he said. "But let's keep things the way they are. Just in case." There it was again. Just in case. I tilted my head, pretending to be curious. "In case of what?" He smiled, the same smile that had once made me trust him. "Oh, life happens. Life happens." I fought the urge to laugh in his face. He had no idea that his backup plan was about to become his only plan. "Oh, life happens. Life happens." I bit my tongue to keep from laughing, because in that moment, Andrew truly believed he had me fooled. He thought he was feeding me a lie, slipping another smooth excuse into the growing pile of deceptions. But in reality, he had just confirmed everything. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. "Proceed with everything." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure?" I had never been surer of anything in my life. Because Andrew hadn't just betrayed me. He had prepared for it. And now, I was preparing too. The beginning of the end. Andrew had no idea his perfect plan was already in flames. While he was sneaking around with Madison, preparing to leave me with nothing, I was quietly pulling every string, setting every piece in motion. And soon, his carefully built backup plan was going to be the only thing he had left. The final moves. The day everything started to crumble for him began like any other. Andrew kissed my cheek before heading to work, his touch lingering just long enough to make the moment feel normal. I almost laughed. By sunset, his entire world would be unrecognizable. I waited for the door to shut, counted to 10, then grabbed my phone. First call? My lawyer. "It's time." He didn't need further instructions. We had already set everything in motion. At noon, I walked into the bank. The teller greeted me with a warm smile. She recognized me, of course. I had handled our finances for years. "How can I help you today?" I slid a document across the counter. "I need to make some changes to our accounts." She took the paperwork. Then she froze. Recognition flickered in her eyes. She understood exactly what was happening. Divorce filings. Asset separation. Andrew wouldn't know it yet, but as of this moment our joint accounts were frozen. Not a single cent would move. Not to Madison. Not to his hidden savings. Not anywhere. I smiled politely. And while we're at it, I'd like to remove Andrew Foster as an authorized user on our credit cards. Step 1. Done. Step 2. The condo. My lawyer had already filed an official inquiry into Andrew's finances. The payments to Madison's apartment? That was bad enough. But the real kicker? Andrew had been using company funds for some of their little getaways. And that? That was corporate fraud. By the time he realized I was ahead of him, it was already too late. 3:45 p.m. The breaking point. My phone rang. I already knew what the forensic accountant was going to say. We found it. The money. Andrew hadn't just been saving for himself. He had been stealing. Funneling company funds into his secret account, disguising them as business expenses. Illegal. Traceable. And now? Reported. The reckoning. By the time Andrew walked through the front door that evening, I was already packed. I sat in the living room sipping wine, calm, controlled. He strolled in, briefcase in hand, utterly unaware that his life had already been set on fire. He smiled at me like nothing had changed. Hey, babe. I set my glass down carefully. Hey, Andrew. I tilted my head. How was work? Then it happened. Andrew's face turned pale as he read through the flood of messages. His bank. His employer. Madison. Each one a blow, unraveling the web of lies he had so carefully spun. But I wasn't done yet. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded document, sliding it across the table with deliberate calm. Oh, and one more thing, I said, watching him stiffen. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. His eyes flicked over the words, confusion morphing into sheer panic. What is this? He whispered. I leaned forward, savoring the moment. It's the lease termination agreement for your condo with Madison, I said sweetly. I had a little chat with your landlord. Since, the payments were coming from an account that's now frozen. Andrew choked on his breath. You canceled my lease? I tilted my head. Not me. The landlord did when I showed him proof that the funds came from fraudulent transactions. I sighed, as if truly sympathetic. It turns out, when you steal from your company, landlords aren't too keen on keeping you as a tenant. His phone rang. Madison. I smiled. I'd answer that if I were you. She might need a place to stay. He hesitated, then slowly pressed the call button. I could hear her voice through the receiver, sharp and angry. What the hell, Andrew? They just kicked me out. I came home and all my stuff was in the hallway. What did you do? His face crumpled. I leaned back in my chair, watching him unravel. Oh, and one last thing, I added. Since your company is pressing charges and your accounts are frozen, I imagine finding a lawyer might be difficult. Andrew's head snapped up. Sophie. I stood, grabbing my bag. Enjoy your backup plan, Andrew. I turned and walked to the door, pausing just long enough to throw one final dagger over my shoulder. Oh wait, you don't have one anymore. With that I left, closing the door softly behind me. And Andrew? He was finally out of moves.